Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Care Provider Alliance seminar, which is going to focus on the essential caregiver and how we can support care homes to implement this role. The essential caregiver role was brought in guidance by the government and was effective from the 8th of March 2021. I think it's fair to say that the needs of residents in care homes to have connections with family and friends is absolutely essential to their well-being. And obviously, throughout the pandemic, there has been really difficult moments because people have not been able to contact their relatives or have that connection with them. What the government's visiting process was all about was trying to establish that back again and making sure that people had contact with relatives. There was also a point in the guidance which developed an essential caregiver role, and that was in recognition that many people in the care sector have very close relatives or friends who needed to have much more close contact with them. And the development of the essential caregiver role was to recognise that. I think it's fair to say it was a difficult role to implement and some people were confused by it. And I hope that today's seminar will add some light into how we can deliver it and also give some really practical examples of how some providers have dealt with this and how they've made a success of it. We have a very impressive array of speakers, all of whom have experience in this area. So we're going to hear from Emma Williams from the Residents and Relatives Association, from Pippa Foster from NCHA Care and Support, from Clinton Taylor, who is the Group Clinical Director at Maria Maliband, and also from Alison Murray, the Head of Inspection at CQC. I think those people who are going to present are going to really give us some clear examples of how this can be made to work within care homes. I also hope this is going to be a very interactive seminar. So do pose your questions and put them in the chat box. And I hope we'll be able to answer some of them, because it's by working together and talking about how to make this work that we will, of course, be able to ensure that the essential caregiver role and the re-establishment of visiting happens in care homes. Those are all the introductory remarks that I want to make. And so I'd now like to introduce Emma Williams from the Residents and Relatives Association. Thanks very much, Emma.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Martin. So my name's Emma Williams. I'm from the Relatives and Residents Association. And perhaps if we can slip through to what exactly, thank you. So who are we? We're quite a small charity, but we are set up to support older people primarily through their relatives and their friends. And then we take what they tell us to form our own awareness and raise the awareness of their experiences to inform our policy and our practice and our campaigns. So the next slide gives you details of our helpline, and that's one of my roles is to work on that helpline. But going to the next slide, I think before I go in to tell you, to share with you the experiences that we're hearing, I do want to highlight how very much people who contact us are really sympathetic and aware of the difficulties that care providers have been through, and are very aware of the fact that loss of residents and sometimes colleagues has had a huge impact on care providers and their staff that work within care settings. So I think there is a lot of empathy from friends and families of residents of just how difficult it has been. But while if we go to the next slide, which sort of highlights why I'm here, is to share with you sometimes what is not always clearly expressed for various reasons. For one thing, empathy of what care providers are going through and staff are going through, how family and friends have felt through the pandemic. So for many care homes, it's been a hideously busy time, very, very stressful. But for relatives, it's moved very slowly. And there's been a tremendous sense of fear and anxiety about being closed away from people that they love. And more recently, 18 months on, there's been a slight shift. So what we're hearing, and I should really flag up that for a helpline that covers every aspect of care, during the last 18 months, 95% of all our calls, the primary concern is visiting, which is very significant to historically to us. And there's an impatience. So society is opening up, and they feel left behind, and they feel unheard. And I'm not talking about the care sector, I'm talking about society in general. And on top of that, care providers are very rightly sharing their anxieties about staffing levels, being able to find enough new staff, concerns over vaccines and the impact on that. But there's a very much of a juxtapositioning of messages coming out and feeding into friends and families that it's helpful to be aware of. So the next slide, please. And the reason why people are so concerned, as Martin has already really eloquently established, family members are an essential part of people's health and well-being. Family members, a lot of people in care have cognitive disabilities, so they're worried about deterioration, impacts on relationships. And it's also a loss of role. So many people will be attorneys for health and welfare, but they're also generally just advocates for people that are vulnerable. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So as Martin has already established, we have visiting guidance, and it covers a number of different visiting means of establishing relationships. This has been, as I said, Martin's already introduced essential caregivers in March this year. And that is where I want to concentrate, because I think from everything that we're hearing from providers, we're hearing from family members, we're hearing from staff, is that essential caregivers is such an important role for the sector, residents and families. If we could go to the next slide, please. So visiting is a very bland word. It can be anything from a museum to a resident, but it's essential to supporting family relationships, and it's part of good care provision. So if you wouldn't mind just clicking, I think 4 times, we'll just go through these rather than just unravel them. And these are the reasons why it's important as care providers to promote and establishing good visiting practice. So we've already established, we have now guidance that provides, establishes means of which relationships can be re-established. But there's also very clear legislation and regulations behind this. You've got the Care Quality Commission's regulations, you've got the Mental Capacity Act, you've got the Human Rights Act, you've got the Equality Act, not forgetting the Care Act. I'm not going to run through those today. We have a document called Visiting and the Law. It's available free from our website, and I'd invite you all to take a look if you wish. It goes through all of these. But the legislation and the guidance is there for exactly that, promoting the well-being of residents, but it's also rebuilding relationships with your staff as well as residents. So if we just click one more time, I'd like to share with you feedback that we got from Janet Galloway, the head of care quality at BCOP, who essentially said that introducing essential caregivers increased the morale of staff significantly. The reason being is that they felt part of the community again. They didn't feel so alone, and that they in turn could share things with members of families coming in. And I really want to highlight that in greater detail by sharing with you 2 examples. So first one I want to talk about is Mr. and Mrs. James. They'd been married for 60+ years, never really spent a day apart before Mr. James needed to move into a care home. He was a wanderer. He found it really difficult to stay still. Even when he was engaging in things, he liked to move about. And he was very dependent on his wife. The first care home introduced very strict, well, it had no visiting. So his only contact was suddenly via the telephone, which he couldn't engage with. He became violent, became agitated, very distressed, and there was talk of medication. Instead, working with the family, the social worker, he was moved to another care home where they carried out individual assessment to establish his own visiting plan. And it was decided that there's no way that Mr. James could sit in a room and do a visit. So they looked at how could they support Mrs. James enter the home and support her husband. So she went through a DBS check. She did infection and safeguarding training, and she follows the same processes as staff members do with infection control. The result is a complete turnaround in Mr. James's behaviour. He's now gone back to a happy, relaxed fellow that he was before. The staff have far less to worry about because when she's there, they don't need to worry about where he is. Is he attempting to do something dangerous or inappropriate, or is he going to annoy another resident by being too exuberant? She's happy because she's got her relationship back with her husband, and it's just been a win-win for everyone. Another example is Sharon and Emily. Sharon is Emily's daughter and became very aware that Emily was closing down. Staff members could no longer communicate or get a response from her. So they carried out a risk assessment, and they agreed that Sharon, one of her daughters, would come in and be an essential caregiver. They weren't expecting much because she didn't really say, wasn't talking, didn't recognize, wasn't showing any forms of recognition of people. But there was a transformation with a number of weeks. Having regular contact with her daughter, she began talking again. She began recognizing her daughter again, and not only Sharon, but her sister, who was visiting in a more restrictive manner. And this was an incredible, it's not only a wonderful experience for the family, but it was a wonderful experience for care workers, seeing that transformation, not losing another resident and being part of that care. I think it's really important in all of those instances to really flag up. There was nothing wrong per se with the care that care workers were able to give those individuals. It's about the fact that families have something unique to bring to the care provision. So if we go to the next slide, please. So I want to go through a few mythbusters that we've become aware of, and could you mind clicking through those? So the first is too risky to allow people in. Again, I think those two examples that I've shown shows very clearly that it can be managed. It just needs to be assessed and looked at. I think it's also worth flagging up that essential caregivers are going to follow exactly the same care infection control processes as your staff. But unlike Mrs. James, most of them are only going to be involved in that one resident. And they won't be moving between homes or as agency staff might be. So the risk is relatively low. It's going to take up too much of your staff time. There is no doubt care planning, making sure people know infection control processes, monitoring and supporting that essential caregiver is going to take time. But again, the examples that we've provided, I think clearly show that what you get back from having members of the family working as part of the care team, supporting that resident, frees up time for your own staff to do other things. It's also and is a resource, and resources do need to be invested in, but we do think that it's such an important resource for care homes to consider. And that's, should we involve the family in the process? Well, obviously, if your resident the resident that you're assessing has full mental capacity, it's up to them whether you involve the family. But for the vast amount of family residents, involving the family is both a legal requirement, mental capacity, best interest decision process, Regulation 9, person-centered care, but it's also a real time saver, because it's very difficult to produce a visiting plan when you're not including half of the individuals as part of that. And it also means that if you involve them in the start, you're less likely to have them to come back and ask them to redo it or relook at something. Sorry, and the next one, please. And thank you. So is caregiving only for those with health problems? or to provide personal care? Absolutely not. I mean, the new guidance has clarified that, but it was always part of the role. And the two examples that I've given, and I could give many, show that supporting someone's cognitive ability or mental health has profound impact on the well-being of individuals, and just providing companionship at times when staff may be extremely stretched is a very significant impact on people's lives, and provides a huge support, not just for the resident, but for the home in general. And the next one, please. Does it need to be a history of that person by providing that care? Again, no. The legislation is quite clear about doing reassessments and reassessing risks. And the truth is, where someone was 18 months ago, it's very unlikely that they're going to be in the same place now, or 6 months, or a year, or however long it's been. And people's lives change. So people may not have been able to provide that support, or the pandemic may have changed their whole viewpoint of their priorities. So it's really important to remember that the guidance talks about every resident having that opportunity, and making sure that that all of your residents have those needs assessment carried out as part of their care planning, and identifying, you know, what could an essential caregiver bring to that resident, and whether it's beneficial. And no, it doesn't have to be restricted to one. Again, we're going to go back to Mental Capacity Act, best interest decisions, and personal needs. It's really important. And so most people, it will be one, but you will have residents who do need that additional support from what you can provide. Perhaps someone really only responds to receiving food from loved ones, and one single relative simply cannot go enough times to support that. In those instances, you might want to consider broadening that out to more than one individual. And the next one, please. So, should you stop caregivers visits during an outbreak? And I know that for some care providers, we've certainly heard that directors of public health are encouraging this, but we would strongly advocate against that, and challenging those sort of decisions. Essential caregivers follow your same infection control practices. They are predominantly only having interaction with one resident, and that role prevents the stop-start during an outbreak, and the disruption and the stress that can cause to residents. And the guidance is quite clear of why of those, and the need to continue wherever possible. There will be some situations the resident has COVID, the essential caregiver has been found positive of COVID, but on the whole, that it is a means to keep some stability in a resident's life. And if we could go to the next screen. So what can you do to promote essential caregiving in the oncoming months? Again, make sure all your residents and their families are aware of this role and the visiting options, and make sure you've got everything you've got, involve them in that individual assessments. Maybe share amongst your own local care provider associations what works, what doesn't, and what's useful and what isn't. And also consider the information that you're getting. So I just want to share very quickly what Harriet Wright from Leeds Health Watch shared with me. Their Director of Public Health is working with two infection control nurses and Leeds Health Watch in supporting homes through outbreaks. And one of the things they support them with is continuing those essential care giving roles, in recognition that family members are not an add-on, they are part of the essential care. So if you're not getting that sort of support from your own infection control Department of Health, Director of Public Health, maybe worth directing them to that, or challenging them, because you are the professionals, you understand the full risks every resident has, while directors of public health, primarily their concern is controlling COVID. So I'm going to leave it in your hands. I'm going to encourage open cultures and treating families as a part of the partners. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Emma. And I think it was really helpful that you gave those practical examples, and also that you've given us the heads up to go to your website to get the legal position, and that's really helpful as well. So I hope that members will go to the website and look at that documentation. Our next speaker is Pippa Foster from Nottingham Community Housing Association, their care and support division, and they've been looking at how they've been implementing this, and also how they've offered it to some relatives and haven't taken it up. So we're really looking forward to hearing your experience, Pippa.
Thank you, Martin, and thank you, Emma, for a really useful, insightful and considered presentation. I'm Pippa Foster. I'm the Head of Care and Support for NCHA. We are based in the East Midlands and deliver affordable and social housing, as well as care and support, and that's the bit that I head up. We deliver about 1 million hours of support a year, and I've got 800 colleagues enabling this across the department. Within that, we have a number of different services, but we have a care home service, and within that we have 8 care homes. And that's a mixture of people, older person services, learning disabilities, specialties, mental health, and transforming care. I've worked in this sector for nearly 30 years now, and I started life as a care assistant in a care home for older people for a really long time. So this is an incredibly important debate and discussion, and very close to the centre of my heart. This photo, I'm looking slightly manic. This is me early on in the pandemic, propping my laptop up on a trainer box in my kitchen. And I was really aware of my stress system. I was really aware of my fight and my flight, my adrenaline, my cortisol. All sorts of things were happening in my body and my mind as we were at the beginning of the pandemic. It was stressful for everybody and unpredictable. I was really aware that I needed to understand all the complex and confusing and ever-changing guidance so that I could support my teams and the managers to continue to deliver excellent services, and so the people were safe living there. It certainly was not business as usual, and we are still business unusual, I think. And I'm not sure whether we in this sector will ever get back to the place that we were. But that's okay. We can work together and make sure that we can do things in the right way and in a better way with what we've got. I'm delighted to have been invited to join this really, really important discussion and bring some information and experience from a workforce wellbeing and mental health perspective. The mental health impact on our workforce is significant. There's a growing body of evidence. This is a BMJ article from early on in the pandemic, really highlighting the mental health impact on key workers. And of course, key workers are all of our care assistants, support workers, and project managers working across the sector, delivering care in care homes. And we know that stress has a short-term and a long-term impact on our body and mind. Next slide, please, Victoria. Thank you. And as an organisation, my background is in mental health and psychology. It's incredibly important for me to know that my workforce is supported, that they are aware of what might be going on in their bodies and their minds, and how that might be impacting on their decision making and how they're feeling about coming to work, about being at home, and the whole kind of unfolding situation as the pandemic was. Next slide, please. We know that a little bit of stress can be really helpful. We've all experienced that tickle of adrenaline that kind of gets us excited and helps us get through, a bit like doing a presentation today. A little bit of excitement is really good. But what we do know is that over time, this can really start to cause some problems. And as you can see from this graph here, the longer those stress levels go on, it can lead to stress overload, more panic, anxiety, and burnout. And we're hearing a lot about this in the press and within our own organisations about the impact on our workforce. So for me, for our organisation, and from lots of people across the sector, it's important to talk about how we are feeling. And it's important to recognise that being vulnerable in this is okay, as long as we can name it and talk about it. Now, one of the things I wanted to highlight to our teams is something called anticipatory anxiety, which I think is incredibly important in a pandemic where we don't know what's going to happen. We haven't got any control. Anticipatory anxiety is where we worry about what might happen in the future and we catastrophize. I imagine we've all been there over the past 18 months and we recognise this. I wanted our workforce to understand what might be happening to themselves and might be happening to each other so they could talk about it. And also what might be happening to our people living in the services, to friends and families. Next slide, please. So one of the things we did, amongst many things that I'm sure you will all agree with, was writing some guidance. And we did this around not only what people should be doing in reflection to the government guidance, but around people's mental health and well-being, and with lots of guides to help people get through. Next slide, please. And we know that our registered managers are a phenomenal group of people. They have an incredible responsibility and they really care, and they worry. They worry about ensuring that they deliver kind, compassionate, dignified, safe and high quality services at all time. Really hard in a pandemic. They care deeply about the physical, emotional and psychological well-being of everybody who lives in their services, but all of the people in their teams and their families and their friends. Infection control naturally is a massive worry for them, and how we weave in the complex collaborative working with lots of other NHS and social care providers. And of course, they're worrying about what might be released from government guidance next. Then they worry about their family, and I think probably lastly, they worry about themselves. So you can see there's lots of opportunity here for anticipatory anxiety. We know that delivering person-centered support is a fundamental reason for having choice and control. This is key and at the heart of this. And also at the heart of this, as mentioned before, is a right to family life. It's a human right. Connection is important. It's at the heartbeat for all of us. And people at our services absolutely have the right to be connected to their families and friends. And we endeavour to do this at all times. We know that government guidance has restricted our choice and control for everybody at times, but this has been particularly challenging for our residents, service users, friends and family. But it's very important that we don't let this stop us making decisions. And for us, we make decisions based on risk. And really, this has been no different throughout COVID. As mentioned before, Emma, having individual, flexible, dynamic and person-centered risk assessments means that we can do things. We don't need to close down in fear. We don't need to do this. We can be responsive and person-centered. And in fact, we must be. And I work with a lot of peers across the sector, and I would say this is a sector standard for good quality providers. And where things feel risky and we're worried, and a pandemic is very new for us all, we work really closely with Public Health England and Infection Control and any other key partners to make sure that we have joint risk assessments. This has been our approach to visitors, and we've never had a blanket ban. And we support our managers with guidance and tools so they can make decisions, but also manage their anxiety and the worries of their workforce. Next slide, please. One of the things we did earlier on when things were opening up again was to write specific guidance for our workforce, outlining what they should be doing, reflecting government guidance, but also our organisational expectations. And if we pop to the next slide, you can see there's 4 sections there, and we had some detailed information about risk assessments for every possible type of visit, a table of wishes, really understanding what's important for people living in our services and their families. So we understood this from a person-centered perspective. any booking systems that were necessary, and a visiting code. And a section within this guidance was all about communicating with family and friends. We do this out of pandemic times, so why would this change? And in fact, even more important, to have that connection and that conversation and that dialogue so everybody feels like they know what's going on. And we're in this together. We can't do this alone and in a siloed approach. We provided a template letter that they could amend to write to families and friends to say, this is what's going on for us, asking for feedback, and just making sure that we were sharing information on an ongoing basis and being really transparent and using very helpful documents like the Keeping Connected document. Next slide, please. But we knew, I know, I was running our wellbeing workforce group for the organisation and wrote an organisational action plan. I couldn't reach every one of the 800 members of my wider team, but we could reach the project managers. So we did a wellbeing programme, and there was lots and lots of different things that we did, including having regular action learning set, peer support, resilience test, some training, individual action plans, and increase of supervisions. I also put forward a business case to have a wellbeing manager. It was getting a bit tricky for me to try and do this as well as my job. And you know, there was no irony there that my well-being needed to be considered as well. And I'm delighted that our organisation went, yes, now more than ever do we need a real focus on well-being for the entire organisation. And we have employed a wellbeing manager who started with us a few months ago, and I'm working very closely with her about what this looks like for supporting us. But in the short term, she's been doing debriefing sessions, supporting the immediate impact of what's happened, but supporting us with our resilience, our well-being, so we can move forward together, feeling good about what we're doing. We're working with clinical psychologists to rewrite our debriefing policy and have a new set of qualified debriefing deliverers across the organisation. And recently, we have a number of us have been doing a coaching qualification, and we will have a coaching pool open to the organisation and really pushing a culture of talking about openness so that we can be the best people to deliver the best support possible. Next slide, please. We now have a wellbeing toolkit, and we refresh and review. I mean, you'll all know there's a hell of a lot of resources out there, and it can be a bit confusing about where to go and what to look at. So we hope that we've streamlined this, particularly for our staff members, for them to use with each other, for managers to use, and to have conversations that enable us to understand more, to self-reflect and be more aware of how this might be impacting us. Next slide, please. The final comment really from me, and it really speaks to what Emma was saying, and I think what everybody would agree, that we are nothing without collaboration and co-production, and working together is absolutely essential. And Martin, you'd said I'd been invited to talk about us and our essential caregiver role. Well, we offered it out. We think it is an absolutely brilliant role and essential. But interestingly, nobody has taken up the offer at the moment. They have said, if we go back into a lockdown, I would definitely want to do it. So we're trying to encourage people, well, why don't we sort it out now so that we're not having to deal with it if and when, hopefully not, that doesn't happen. But we continue to have those conversations and promote it. And absolutely, we'll promote it with our directors of public health and anything that we need to do to support the sector and to support this, because we know that it's important and essential to be transparent, to collaborate and to co-produce, because we can achieve more by doing that. But don't just take my word for it. This is a piece that I asked my services manager to speak from her heart about managing 8 care homes in a pandemic. So I asked her not to plan, not to prepare, and just provide something which I hope will be useful for you. So I'm going to hopefully hand over to the magic of technology and Sue.
person-centered processes that we have had in place for some time. We were very aware that we had to do something to everyone, which made it feel like it was very impersonal, quite utilitarian, really. So what we wanted to do was turn that around and make it a person-centered process. We used the person-centered dynamic risk assessment. We tried to ensure that wherever possible, we considered the individual needs, wishes, and beliefs of the service user when we were sorting out how we would facilitate some degree of contact between them and their relatives. We used FaceTime and Skype, WhatsApp, telephones, window visits, or even just people standing at the other side of the window waving frantically. Nothing was going to be too much as long as we complied with the restrictions, but were able to keep people's spirits up. It was terribly isolating for service users. They were stuck in care homes and they couldn't get out. And sometimes if there was outbreaks, they were in their rooms for a long, long time. We wanted to never lose sight of the impact that was going to have on the people we support. It was important then more than ever that we keep a very person-centered, individualized approach to how we support people through it. Government guidance was a bit confusing, I think, but at least it was there because we found ourselves always looking for someone to say something that would help us navigate our way through the pandemic. But it was really, really important that service users didn't lose touch with the people that they cared about and who cared for them outside of the care home. So we kept in touch as much as possible. If we ever spoke to them, we sent that back through to the service user to let them know, we'd have a chat with them. If they had photo albums, we took them out. If there was any way we could keep these people in the forefront of their minds, just so that we could say it won't always be this way, you will see them again, let's keep the faith. Sometimes it's really difficult because the service users didn't understand or they weren't able to fully comprehend what was going on. So it was up to us really to make sure that we compensated as much as possible for any loss they may feel by not being and having that close contact with people they cared about. I think registered managers had a huge job because it was never a boring job before the pandemic, and then all of a sudden there was so much more to do. And of course we were all inside, we weren't going anywhere, so we did have quite a bit of time to sit down and plan how we maintained a certain level of infection control that we could be sure would keep service users and staff safe. New structures, new procedures, a lot of new equipment, PPE, all of it had to come in, had to be ordered, had to be used properly. And it was down to the project managers and the staff to ensure that as much as they possibly could, they would keep that virus away from their front door. Everybody was feeling frightened. Everybody was feeling scared. It was really difficult for people to focus on doing a really good job and then going outside of the job and having the same worries outside. Boundaries got a bit blurred. People reacted very differently. But I think what project managers did was remember individuals just the same way as they do with service users of their staff, and they adapted their approach in line with how and what they knew about the individual and what would work best for them. I think project managers are going to feel the pandemic for a long time. I can see in the eyes of the project managers that I support that they are still very wary and they're waiting for the next lockdown and the next surge. And I know I'm going to have my work cut out for me to try and get them past it, but I'm confident that they will get past it. Their caring and their compassion is where this comes from, and that will also guide them safely out at the end of the day. And I'm deeply affected by the strong bonds that project managers have with the staff and the colleagues that they work with. I'm deeply affected by the fact that they were joined together in a fight that was impossible because we never knew when it was going to start or where it was going to end. I know that those bonds are there now, and they're built on sound professional practice and sound understanding of human rights and of the importance of ensuring that service users were at the forefront of our decision making. I don't know how this is going to manifest itself after COVID is over, if that's ever going to happen. But I do know it's almost certainly going to require some level of considered approach. We have a well-being manager, which is totally awesome, but we also have plans in place around debriefing, and we have a well-being action plan to sort of respond as and when people come to us with problems or concerns or anxieties. I know that I didn't turn my phone off for a really long time, because you can never plan when you're going to have a meltdown in situations like this and you're managing 24-hour services. But I also know that if anyone did contact me in the small hours, project manager, that it was always justified, and that, you know, I would sit there and I would listen to them and try as much as I can to empathize and support them through whatever drama or crisis was driving them to make that call. And I knew that because that was the consideration and courtesy I got from my line manager, and I know how important it was. I think there was a real risk that we would start treating everybody the same if we weren't careful, and we just kept that, you know, visible, and we fought it whenever we could, because we had seen all those horrible videos and we did not want to be that kind of care home service. So the essential caregiver role, I really wish we would have had it back at the beginning of this. I know that's easy for me to say, because I think it would have had a stronger uptake than it's having right now. But it doesn't matter that people that we've spoken to, they're not really keen. I think they're kind of feeling like they won't need it anymore, and I completely understand that, and God bless their optimism. But we've made sure that all the people who visit us regularly know about the role, and we've had a chat with them about what it means and what it does, and we've asked them to take information away just in case they need it. I think if we went into another lockdown, if we went into another surge, I think we would have people saying, actually, I don't want not to see my father or my brother. Can we talk about this? And that will be absolutely fine. We'll try and respond to that. But I think the reason it hasn't actually taken up so much is because people don't feel it's needed right now. I think if we'd have offered it during the first or second lockdown, we might have had people quite keen to take it up, and that would be understandable. You know, it's been the most difficult time, it's been the most trying time, but the one thing no one can ever argue is that we haven't seen the very best in the human beings that work for us. I'm always moved to tears by some of the efforts they went to ensure that people were safe, people showing up with their sleeping bags saying, I'll stay here. And, you know, we had, you know, major staffing issues with people who were testing positive and had to self-isolate. And sometimes that would all but destroy a team of its key support workers. But we managed it. We managed it because people would you know, volunteer, would just get on with it and just work with it. And it feels quite different now, but when I look back at it, in spite of all the horrors and terrible things that have happened during the pandemic, I do have memories of the amazing lengths that people will go to demonstrate compassion and thoughtfulness and care towards people who are vulnerable and people who need our support. And I think that we're very, very lucky to have staff that do that, and they outnumbered the staff that didn't want to do that, which was amazing. But leading people through this has made me a different manager, and I know has affected the project managers that I support. And it isn't all bad. It isn't all full of fear and, you know, anxiety. Some of it is about thinking, oh, look at this, we did this, and we need to be proud of ourselves that we did it. And I think what's really fortunate for us is that the organisation we work for is very keen to echo that, yes, you are valued, and we are very grateful.
Well, thank you very much, Pippa, and that was a great presentation from Sue as well. And I think the takeaways that I have from that are that your work was focused on the well-being of your residents, your families and your staff, and you also were creative and dynamic in how you tried to navigate through these incredibly choppy waters. But something that you said, which was really important, I think, the recognition that people needed to have contact with their nearest and most loved people in order to maintain their well-being. So I think that's been a really good practical example of how you and your organisation responded to this pandemic.
Thank you.
Thanks. Our next speaker is Clinton Taylor, who is the Group Clinical Director at Maria Maliband. Clinton is going to talk about some of their experiences. And I know, Clinton, that you worked very closely with Jenny and Diane and colleagues from Rights for Residents. And I want to also say a personal thank you to both Jenny, Diane and all their colleagues at Rights for Residents, because they've worked very cooperatively. And Clinton, they speak extremely highly of you and the way in which you and your organisation responded to their desire to keep that contact with families and relatives. So we're really looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks. Good morning, Martin. I must say, Emma and Pip, the presentation, absolutely phenomenal. Thank you so much. I've actually learned quite a few new things as well. So I'm really, really happy with that. So the purpose of the Maria Maliband actually joining the call today was just to give a few practical examples of how, as a provider, we've encompassed the actual visiting protocols. So obviously we have the normal visiting protocols and the essential caregiver protocols. Next slide, please. So the visiting as a whole hasn't been without its issues. Protocols, policy change. So we've had a lot of policy change over the last 18 months. Some of it's been very complicated. They've not been without problems. And from a provider point of view, having never experienced a pandemic of such scale, I still remember the 13th of March last year when we took the first phone call from one of our services with the media coverage of what on earth is going on. We don't know what to do. How do we do this? And I think a lot of the visiting protocols, a lot of our services have experienced has been the confusional state of procedures, policies in terms of protocols, media coverage. So there's been all this somewhat negative perspective of visiting in terms of what processes to follow. And as a corporate, potentially what we've tried to do is to streamline this for our services. So Maria Maliband operates 80 services, predominantly older persons across the whole of the UK. And obviously we appreciate there are differences in terms of visiting procedures for Northern Ireland, Scotland and Jersey. But fundamentally the English majority of our services are in England, with a lot of different catchment areas in terms of local policy and national policy when it came to visiting. We had a lot of apprehension. A lot. That came from every member of the organisation. We were dealing with a pandemic where nobody knew what was going to happen. We didn't know how unwell people were going to be. There was a lot of confusion about, is it safe? Who can we actually support to come back into our care homes? Do we allow new residents to come into the care homes? So it's not just visiting, it's actually people potentially looking for care for their later years. Our services were very, very frightened. We as a senior management team were extremely scared, but more so because we knew there had to be very clear guidance and structure for our care services to be the best that they could be, but to maintain the safety of our residents living with us, visitors that were visiting, but more so the staff and their ability to be able to manage a situation that they've never dealt with. We had increase in locum staff, which then caused issues with staffing, which then in return caused problems with the consistency for visiting regimes. You know, staff were diagnosed with coronavirus, they were off sick, so that increased the level of agency. Each area that the agency workers may have used or may have worked in had completely different processes. So that for me is the negative aspect of the visiting protocols. But what I will say is our clear message is it has and can become more manageable and workable. Next slide, please. So there is significant positives, and I'm a very fond believer in the face of adversity, there are positives. And with the visiting protocols, the welcoming back of visitors has kept our care services somewhat back in the normal pattern of the world. What that may look like moving forward is going to be anybody's guess, but it's all about making sure that the impact for our residents is safe, it's secure, that their health and well-being is being managed and supported effectively, but our care staff feel supported by the wider community. Our staff now are a lot more confident. They were exceptionally apprehensive. They didn't know what was going to happen. They almost lived in a bubble within the care homes with their with the residents. Some of our staff moved into some of the care homes. The whole new way of working in terms of IPC, infection prevention and control measures. In 25 years of nursing, I've never seen a care home staff have to wear masks. Hand washing protocols were to the maximum. The provision of PPE, the education of infection prevention and control, the one-way routes around buildings. So all that is, even though the pandemic has had its struggles, the staff at the same token have actually learned a completely different set of skills, a better set of skills, a more enhanced level of skills, which then in return supports our residents moving forward into the future for safety. Some of the fantastic opportunities that we had was with visiting was to speak. We entered into a world of complete technology. We had Microsoft Teams, we had Zoom, we had more technology with iPhones, iPads, tablets, and we decided to support our relatives and residents with staff to look at communication. Communication is the key with the visiting protocols, education, communication, the sharing of information, but more so telling people that we are scared, but we are willing to work with people with the visiting protocols. We're willing to guide people. And it's a two-way process. Some of our families organise support groups for the wider relative group, where we have the most amazing relatives who wanted to be involved in supporting other relatives in terms of visiting, what their experience was, saying, you know, almost being a voice for the care home alongside us, and actually speaking to other relatives and saying, this is what we do when we visit, this is how we need to do it, and these are the reasons, and these are the things that we can overcome. That gave the relatives the input they needed to know that actually, because a lot of relatives were actually scared about visiting themselves, they didn't want to come into the care homes. They were, you know, they were seen in a lot of areas as potential persons who could bring coronavirus into the care, to the care home. So there's a lot of confidence building just with visitors alone. Implementation of the new processes led to very, very strengthened safety protocols, which again, when we look at the service being as safe as it can possibly be, the visitors supported that. We had a lot of relatives who were concerned about the visiting protocols, but with the communication, with the education, with the discussions that we had, we were able to overcome potential complaints about or negative feedback about services. And it's because the communication was so strong, updating websites, sending letters out, our staff being able to communicate the same message across the whole of the group. What fascinated me the most was the creativity when it came to our services being able to support visitors back in. The most creative of pods, screens, rooms, it still to this day gives me goosebumps with some of the most amazing and creative ideas, some of the most colourful of visiting pods I have ever seen in my life. The personal touch, the residents being involved with the creation of the pods, for example, the gardens being separated so that persons that were living with dementia were able to see their loved ones in a safer environment. The community feel was absolutely phenomenal. There was a happier atmosphere, but the biggest outcome for us was that shared understanding that staff were unsure about the processes at first. They were educated and they were able to communicate that to relatives. When the visiting started, we were able to educate relatives, we were able to educate residents as well, because we had a workforce suddenly wearing masks when our residents weren't used to that. But then we also had on the the most creative side again is residents actually wanting to wear masks themselves, but actually at the same time, what we could say is bling them up. So we had residents with the most amazing masks on because they wanted to be a part of something that was happening in the world. And their relatives, again, when visited, when actually visiting the services, wore masks, but they then saw their loved one, the resident, with a mask of their own personality, which was phenomenal. Next slide, please. So, Martin, obviously, thank you for touching on the work from Diane and Jenny from Rights for Residents. I'll just give you a little bit of history with Diane and Jenny. I received, I was chairman of Maria Malaban, received a heartwarming letter from Diane and Jenny, and it was passed down to myself purely because I've been leading with our chief nursing officer on the actual pandemic response for the company. So it was to keep it more streamlined. I contacted Diane and Jenny and I was very humbled. They were reaching out as relatives of loved ones in care homes and saying to ourselves as an organisation, can you help us? But more so, can you listen to us? Can we have a talk about essential caregivers? Can we share with you information that we've had from some of our relatives that have residents within our care services and they've not been able to find a way, for whatever reason, to express some concerns? So I'll be, quite upfront and honest. There were a few areas with the essential caregivers where we had relatives who wished for the ECG status to become more available within the company. And I quite rightly said to Diane and Jenny, but isn't that for persons who need physical care and support? And then when we had a lot of dialogue, a lot of conversations, it transpired that the early information that was given to a lot of the care establishments was that it was more geared towards personal care and support rather than the mental health and well-being of an individual. A lot of conversations took place with Diane and Jenny, two completely inspirational ladies, I've got to say. We had laughs, we had tears. It was very emotional, a lot of the conversations, but the outcome for the company in terms of essential caregivers is that we held a complete series of different national conference calls with our teams to explain what essential caregiver status was within the sector. And more so to explain that actually personal care is one part of a person's daily occurrence within one of our services, but the mental health and well-being is phenomenally important. And 6, 7, 8, 9, 12 months on, it became very apparent our residents were tired of not being able to see their loved ones in maybe a longer. They were restricted in terms of visiting. The easiest way that I could explain in terms of a particular example would be, we have a husband and wife. Mrs. lives within one of our care homes, and her husband used to visit for 5, 6, 7 hours per day, and used to quite frequently just sit in the room, just read the newspaper to his wife. They'd been married for 56 years. Mrs. was in her bed for most of the time. Mr. would just sit in the room, have a cup of tea, talk, sing, play music, but a lot of that stopped because the original visiting protocols had meant that visits were restricted, they were time specific, it was dependent on testing, etc. And then when I was talking about this particular scenario with Diane and Jenny, we then thought, well, actually, the mental health and well-being of not just the actual resident, but that of the relative who's of older age was equally as important. That person suddenly, the lady who was living with us, was not experiencing the life she was accustomed to in the significant length that she had. They spent 2 days apart in their 50+ years of marriage, and we then decided we need to look at our processes and procedures within the company. We had some very quite frank discussions with legal teams, with operations teams, with our senior executive teams to make sure that we had a shared consensus on, actually, we now need to take visiting protocols to a completely new level. Next slide, please. For us, it was very, keep it simple, make it effective. That's what we decided to do, because that would support our care homes, that would support our staff. We created a policy and an exceptionally simple process, and Diane and Jenny reviewed that for us. We wanted their input to make sure that we were highlighting the salient points of what the essential caregiver status was. We had various Teams calls, we had them recorded, we had them on our internal system so that staff could watch them, that we could actually explain to them that we have your normal ad hoc visitors who would pop in for 15 minutes, but then we have people like the gentleman I was just talking about, who actually the care of his wife was significantly important, the mental health and well-being of her husband, just being sat in the room with her, being able to at times hold her hand when she became distressed, tidying her bedroom drawers, moving furniture, tidying the cupboards, the little things, but knowing that the resident knew that her husband of 50+ years was still in a close proximity. Also being able to encourage the lady to eat and drink when she was finding it difficult because her mood was becoming worsened, because the input that she was used to, we knew she was missing something in life. We highlighted the risks. So obviously we sat down with the resident and with the relative, and we explained that there is a very clear process. We don't do time specific in terms of essential caregivers. At the end of the day, it's about that quality time. But as Pippa mentioned in the previous presentation, it's about the dynamic risk assessment approach. It's about making sure that the risk assessment approach is relevant, it's safe, it's critical for the health and well-being of that particular individual, but also be open and honest. There are certain scenarios where we've had people try and mention the essential caregiver, but actually it's not essential caregiver. So we've had to be, in some respects, quite descriptive, but supportive at the same time. But also say to people that it's okay to be worried. That's the biggest key thing, because I think we're a bit of a society where things are shrugged off. And we've said it's okay to be scared, it's okay to be worried. Equally, it's okay for us to walk by your side and guide you through this process. We discussed the benefits with our workforce. That was the key, because the staff were scared originally of the prolonged exposure of people coming in. We had the pods, we had the screens, we had distance visits, 2 meters social distancing. So we had all that. Then suddenly we were actually saying in a bedroom, for example, we have an essential caregiver who's going to potentially sit there for a few hours with their loved one. And it was to build the confidence and trust with the relatives, with the staff. So we had Teams meetings, we had telephone calls, we had garden visits with some of our staff and some of our essential caregivers, where staff were able to say, it would help us if you did this. And it was that mutual understanding and that mutual agreement. Residents, the benefits of ECG status far outweigh the negatives. It's got to be said. Residents are happier, the relatives are happier, but we're moving towards a new, safer norm. And there's also less negative feedback caused by frightened emotions, because a lot of negativity was caused by fear. How we implemented it, we updated our website. Sometimes, I'll be honest, wasn't always updated as timely as it could. I used to sit there at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night waiting for the government guidance to hit the Monday morning. We had 24-hour helpline, we had 24-hour email. Yeah, it was an interesting it still is an interesting 18 months. We had regular staff webinars. There was always a member of the senior management team available for our services who were experiencing any difficulties, because we have to make sure they're confident and comfortable to be able to adopt these processes with our residents, with their relatives. Communication to relatives, at times it was not as quick as it could have been. We openly admit that. Diane and Jenny supported us to find out different ways of communicating in different forums. Relatives actually said, we will proofread some of your documents. so that the communication going out to relatives. And then obviously we have the creation of an ECG assessment process, which is very, very specific. And when the ECG, I think we have 79 services, 3,500 residents, 5,000 plus staff. We only have actually 32 essential caregivers across the whole of the company. And that's majority of persons who've requested essential caregivers status have been that's been approved, that's been discussed. A very, very fantastic, amazing plan is there. We expect it to increase as time moves forward. However, the visiting protocols, as we currently know, are slowly being removed. Services are becoming more confident. And I think it's really important for me just to stress that it isn't just for personal care. It's mental health and well-being, it's lifestyle. It's making sure every second that resident experiences is as fruitful and fulfilling, but equally for their relatives, but equally that the staff know that what they're a part of is such a unique and emotional bubble, so to speak. They're a part of that. ECG persons can continue to visit in an outbreak. Obviously, if they sadly test positive for coronavirus or the resident themselves, that obviously differs. The guidelines are a lot clearer now than they probably were 12 months ago in terms of ECG status. And I would recommend people just take time to read it with other people. And especially from providers' point of view, just have a look and just cross-reference your policies with things. Just we found with some of the guidance, just copying and pasting made it quite simple towards the end. At the beginning, it was difficult. Towards the end of the latest visiting regimes, actually became a lot more easier. We've got stricter safety measures for ECG persons than ad hoc visits. And if I'm quite honest, the persons who have applied for the ECG status, they have wanted to be vaccinated. They have wanted to have the testing. They're doing more testing than we would expect under the normal. And some of them are even doing additional testing on top. But that makes them feel confident knowing that their relative, when they visit, and the staff that they come into contact with are going to be safe as well. Like I say, for me, the greatest emphasis is on mental health and well-being. We're 18 months into one of the most complicated parts of health and social care history. The sheer dedication by every one of our services and every other health and social care, even retail, even transport, their dedication across the board still quite often brings me to tears, and it does that. And essential caregiver status, I do seriously thank Diane and Jenny. Their input has been valuable. They've gone through life tragedy themselves, but they've carried on going. But they have never been boisterous towards us. We've had a real few giggles. They've challenged me, but one day I will meet them face to face. Everything's been by teams. That's really, Martin, all I've got to say at the moment.
Thank you very much for that, Clinton. And that was a really good example of an organisation that went through a journey on how to implement this and who listened to relatives and to staff and decided that they were going to work to make this happen in your organisation. And I really appreciate the openness with which you gave us the analysis of that journey. It was really helpful. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Alison Murray, who is the Head of Inspection for Adult Social Care at the Care Quality Commission. And Alison's going to give us a regulator's perspective on this. Thanks, Alison.
Thanks very much, everybody. And I mean, I don't know about you, but that's been an absolute masterclass for me in how to promote, how to facilitate, how to manage your way through this incredibly difficult situation. And, you know, as regulator, we really don't underestimate the challenge that the past 18, 20 months has posed for providers, for people using services and their families. And, you know, I'm sure that I'm not alone in that the reason that I moved out of the NHS into social care donkeys years back was because I wanted to be able to look after the whole person, that full person-centered care thing. And it's a real privilege to be able to look after that whole person. And as part of that whole person, of course, they come with their family, their friends, their life history. And during the course of the pandemic, I know our inspectors on their calls with providers have picked up the real distress from providers, from registered managers, from care home staff, that they haven't been able to care for that whole person in the way that they'd wish because of the constraints that the pandemic put on us. And, you know, we're all coming at this from the same position, whether we're regulator, provider, family member, person using services. We all want the absolute best for the people we're caring for and we love. And during the course of the pandemic, I think there's been a very difficult balance to be trod between managing risk to people and quality of life. And if I'm brutally honest, I don't think that balance has been correct. That for a very long time, the balance was much more in how can we wrap people up in cotton wool, and missing out on those quality of life aspects, especially bearing in mind that your care homes were locked down for such a long period. And you think that the average stay for somebody in a nursing home is what, I'm sure Martin will have the stats somewhere, but you know, we're probably talking around about 12 months, 18 months tops, and they've been locked down for that period of time. So where CQC have been very keen to come from is a position of facilitation. You know, yes, the government guidance was out there, and for large periods, care homes actually didn't have a choice about accepting visitors. They were locked down. But once things started opening up, what we were saying is, please think about this from how can you make this visit happen in a safe way to how can you stop this visit happening. And you know, Pippa raised some really, really good points about risk assessments. It's a standard regulator's response to everything, isn't it? Communicate with everybody, do a full risk assessment, document your decisions and keep it under review, and job done. But to that bit that Pippa was talking about around collaboration and co-production, I would add in communication. So 3 C's there, we do like the magic of 3: collaboration, co-production and communication with everybody. Because the services that we saw who were managing this very well were the ones that were open and honest in their communications, were saying to relatives, actually, we've got a bit of an outbreak situation. We're worried about this at the moment, so we're just closing down on visits just for a little bit. We'll keep you posted and we'll open things up as soon as we humanly can. We're involving relatives in those newsletters. What is it that you want to see? How much detail? Clearly, we can't give CPI out, but what sort of level of detail do you want? We saw, like Clinton, we saw some amazing examples of innovation. I mean, we've got so many pictures of visiting pods in our files now. I have to say, the one that trumped it for me was the care service somewhere in North London that was using a cherry picker. They'd somehow managed to get their hands on some, one of these building cherry picker things, and were actually using it with hard hats and high-vis jackets to get relatives up to windows so they could see loved ones in the upper floors of the service when that person was too ill to move down. I didn't want to see the risk assessment for that. I didn't ask to see the risk assessment for that. But what we've also said is, there are clearly times when things haven't gone as well as people would wish. So what we've been saying is, please, in the first instance, always raise concerns with the service. They need to know what it is that they're not getting right. They need to have those open and honest conversations with you. If you can't get an answer from your open and honest conversations with the provider, by all means tell CQC. You don't need to give your name to tell us about this, but please, please Do tell us the name of the service, because we've got 15,500 care homes. Our inspectors are brilliant, but their crystal balls don't always work when it comes to trying to work out which of those services a particular concern relates to. We don't need to tell the service about your name, but we do need to know the name of that service, where it is, and also importantly the date on which you are having the problems. Because again, the guidance has changed so often during the pandemic. We really need to know whether the advice that you were given at that particular point in time was following the national guidance or not. But when we've had people raise concerns with us, when we've actually dug down and look at those concerns, the huge majority of them weren't relating to visiting bans, weren't relating to genuine refusal of essential caregivers. What it was coming down to was miscommunication. So again, Iris has posted in the chat that transparency statement that is so important in facilitating those conversations. And what was also very clear was that it's difficult for all of us. Visiting does look different to how it used to look previously. There's testing, there's PPE. Some services, because of the size of their service, are having to say, actually, although we'd love to see you all the time, we actually haven't physically got the space to safely do that in our environment and keep proper ventilation, keep people distance, etc. So what we've done a lot of the time is we've facilitated conversations between people who've raised concerns with us and providers. And in the vast majority of cases, we've been able to help promote a proper, a good resolution to those problems. But in a small number of the services that have contacted us, actually, what the concerns that people have raised have been indicative of other problems in the service. So it's helped us make decisions about when we inspect. And in a number of those services, just a small number, when we've gone in, actually the visiting concerns were the tip of the iceberg. And there have been lots of other concerns in those services, and we have taken quite significant enforcement action. When we go out on inspection, visiting is something that we always look at. It's part of our IPC tool, and our inspectors assess how well people are doing this. We're very conscious that over the course of the pandemic, though, we haven't been able to seek as much opinion from people using the service and from their relatives as we've been able to do previously. So we've got a bit of a pilot kicking off in the very near future to look at how we can use experts by experience in contacting people's relatives to get their views about how visiting, for example, are going. And of course, if we do see problems, then we do have a number of regulations that we can hang all of this on. Regulation 9 around person-centred care, Regulation 10, dignity and respect, Regulation 16 around complaints management, also Regulation 17 around good governance, and technically also Regulation 20 around duty of candour. All of these are things that, are very relevant to the issues around visiting and open and transparent visiting. We hope that we don't have to use those regulations and enforcement, because we'd far rather encourage and support services to improve and to facilitate good visiting, but they're there if we need to. Now, I'm very conscious that we've just got 10 minutes left, so I'm very keen that we've got time for questions. So I'm going to finish there and hand back to Martin.
Thank you very much for that, Alison, and some really interesting points that came out there. And I think everybody's presentation has really shown us that this is about a journey, but it's about how we must collaborate with each other to make sure that we get the very best we can for residents, their families, and also for staff. There's some really interesting questions in the chat. So, for example, a question posed by colleagues at Health Watch Leeds, which was really posted to you, I think, Clinton, which was, Given that the essential caregiver role is one where it's about the connection between that person and the well-being of the resident, would there be a situation where ECG status wasn't granted? And if there are situations, what would be the reasons for that?
Thanks, Martin. It's very few and far between. I think when we've looked at the statistics from the company, we've had 2 ECG statuses declined, and that was more so because of the dynamics between what was actual ECG rather than conventional 15-minute visits. There was a lot of process, and unfortunately we do experience, and often through desperation, and I think we can often mitigate it through, you know, good effective communication. We had a family who wanted several ECG statuses, which would have been several separate assessments, etc., and we actually felt it was not in the residents' best interest because the individuals were using a process other than what it was meant to be in terms of visiting, so it was much more complicated. So I think the ECG, because the visiting restrictions actually reduced across the sector, and the homes are becoming more and more confident with allowing visits for longer periods of time, regular visits, more visitors. The ECG status hasn't really taken off in a significant level across our organisation. As Health Watch Lee's mentioned, I think it's really the dynamics of the situation where we've had to be very, very clear in terms of what the benefits are for the individual. The ECG status of a particular family in question, there were 3 persons who wanted ECG status, and actually when we collectively discussed them, we had to follow a best interest process as well. Actually, one key ECG was the best way forward for that particular individual, so it's very much person focused, based on history that we had of the individual, information that we'd obtained from closer relatives, and quite often we had ECG applicants from exceptional far distances, so persons that hadn't visited for 6-7 months prior to the pandemic. So it was weighing up that whole process, but at the same token, being very clear and communicable with people as to what the status is, what other mechanisms can we put in place. So not saying no for ECG as an end result, actually saying, well, actually, have we considered, let's have these regular visits in a different way. So it's about being adaptable as well.
Thanks for that. We also had a really interesting point from Emma Williams about DBSs and whether or not these were needed. So perhaps I can ask Emma Williams that, because of course, I don't know if that's covered, Emma, in your outline for the legal position, which will be on your website.
I think it was quite an extraordinary situation. So the truth is visitors, you're not required to have DBS, but it was about the fact that Mrs. James was moving around in care homes way beyond the communal areas. Husband had advanced cognitive disabilities and had the potential of getting into disputes with other residents. So it wasn't that it was a requirement, it was a means of reassuring the care home about its safeguarding duties against other residents, reassuring other family members, and Mrs. James didn't feel it necessary to challenge and felt that it was, if the shoe was on the other foot, she would be very happy she would feel more content if a relative was taking on that role. And it's the blurry line of essential caregivers. So some care where you are very much a supervisory role. I think it's very arguable she didn't need the DBS, but in this instance, it helped them safeguard other avenues and other concerns. And it was really, I think, to flag up, not the necessity of DBS, definitely don't want to do that, but a means where, yes, there are worries about people coming into homes, having access unsupervised with other residents, and ways of negotiating and making sure that everybody feels secure in that. And certainly, you know, if she had felt uncomfortable in that, I'm sure we would have got involved and debated that, but it didn't feel necessary at the time. So I apologize for the confusion that has evidently caused. My deep apologies.
No, well, thank you. That's a great explanation, and it's a classic case of where we need to have more explanation on these things. And our final one before we finish, Steve from Edentide talked about what would be the position of essential caregivers in a lockdown situation where there were cases of COVID within a home. Alison, what would your view be from the regulator on that?
Oops, sorry, struggling to push buttons there. Now, it may be my brain does get fried on these things, but I'm fairly certain that essential caregivers can still continue to visit even in the event of an outbreak, providing they haven't tested positive themselves. I'm sure that others will leap on me if I've got that wrong.
Thanks for that clarification, Alison. Well, I want to first of all thank all our speakers. I think this has been a very useful seminar from the point of view of really clarifying some of the challenges, but also some of the ways in which people have creatively got over those challenges to ensure that essential caregivers and relatives are still connected with the people they love who happen to live in care homes. Certainly, we've seen from this presentations that we've had the important impact that it has to have your connection with the people you love on the well-being of both the resident and also on the well-being of the person who is visiting. There have also been some really great examples of how the well-being of staff is helped and supported by having people into the care home to support their relatives. So I hope that people have found this a very useful seminar, and it's something which we need to constantly keep continuing to develop, because, as was said at the start of this seminar, the important contribution that the visitors make to the well-being and to the lives of residents cannot be underestimated. So thank you, everybody, and I hope you all have a good weekend. Goodbye.